and the schools, when they had to go to junior high, they had to cross over Canal Street and end up in Little Italy. And that's where they got bullied, and there are huge stories about how as soon as class was over, they all ran home, to run across Canal Street before they got caught by the Italians. Except for one story I remember, where his parents had a laundry right next door to an Italian coffee shop. And he never got bullied and so on. And there was one time that something happened, the Italian kids, they came over and they were, beginning. And the men in that coffee shop came out and just stood there. And the kids disappeared. Why? Because they were the Italian mafia, and they were protected. So that their business, he never got bullied again because they realized that they were being supported or protected by the Italian mafia. So those are some of the stories about the bonds, but also the negatives that occurred. The other phenomenon that happened was to look at why did everybody go to Chinatown? Because in every country throughout the world, whenever we see a Chinese settlement, there's a Chinatown. Why? I think one is for culture, is because that's a place that you can find common kindred people, and two, which is really important time, you weren't allowed anywhere else. That we have stories here of people who tried to buy homes in Queens, and were told that just the experience of what blacks have experienced. No, the house is sold. No, we don't want, he's told that no, it's not available anymore. And they do not want, and then there's more overt as well as covert kinds of discrimination against Chinese who wanted to buy homes. And that was in Queens, in Flushing, where we now know is quite different. Maybe that's what they were afraid of, so the other thing that was prominent during that era, I'm talking about post-World War II, and is that the McCarthy era. In 1949, with the McCarthyism and so on, is that it was a heightened anti-Chinese sentiment throughout the country. And we experienced it in New York, because I was young at the time, and I remember my parents, who didn't speak English, would read Chinese newspapers. They burned those Chinese newspapers because they were afraid if they were found in the garbage can, it would be viewed as communist propaganda, and it was not. It was simply a Chinese newspaper. But that was the kind of fear that went on. And how did that whole context, from 1882 to 1943, the anti-Chinese legislation, the Chinese Exclusion Act was in effect. The Chinese are the only group in history in the United States that were named to be excluded from immigrating to the US. So that we need to look at how currently these issues about immigration occur, and the DACA and all that stuff has great relevance, in the history with Chinese throughout, but also in New York. And the second thing that I fear, even to this day, to mention, and I take care how I mention it in the book, but it's a known fact, is many Chinese came over, quote, what we say, illegally. They bought false identity papers and came over. Why? Because, as I said, there was starvation and so on. It was the only way to come here, and they had the husbands would want to take their wives over, and there was no option because the quota, they were not allowed. You could only come if you were a merchant at the time. And when it was repealed in 1943, it got replaced with a quota system that specifically limited the number of Chinese that can come to the US There was no limit on European immigration, but they will limit it. And that did not get changed into Johnson had the Act of 1965, and that. So during the period before that, many American-born Chinese American citizens lived in fear. My mother would tell me that we had to be secretive because if they ever found, out certain things, that we could get deported. As an American citizen, that we feared, to be deported. Yes?
So the Exclusion Act being in 1882, was that when the railroad had finished or the gold rush had ended? What propelled it at that point?
It was the fear. There was economic. It's always about economics, that it's the economy. Because just like the Mexicans are blamed for taking jobs away, and just like, all this kind of stuff, the Chinese were blamed for taking jobs away. The Chinese were blamed or criticized for living in squalid conditions. Well, they didn't have the money to live in any better conditions. They weren't allowed to do that. So I think that the issue is, you were asking why?
The timing, whether it was they had completed the jobs that, like the railroad, that it was felt they needed.
No, that happened before the completion of the railroads, because there were Chinatowns in California that were literally burned down, as an intentional act of aggression against the Chinese. That never happened, to my knowledge, in New York City's Chinatown, because they preceded our history by, a certain number of years. They almost have one generation more than New York. So that, whereas you have third generation Chinese Americans in California at the time of these members, these were largely second generation. So it's by one generation that there's a difference. And that the anti-Chinese generation was the Yellow Peril, the worry that they were, and Chinese became allies with the US when we were at war with Japan. Because at that point, there was a need to separate out the enemy, who was Japanese, and the Chinese could become allies. That changed in 1949 when communism took over China. So that there's been a very mixed history about that relationship and the kinds of things. So when I say fear, is that if I look at some of the current governmental policies, there's nothing to say that all the people in this book who are second and their children are third generation could not get called and put into some kind of detention. Why? Because that's what happened to the Japanese. During World War II, these were second and third generation Japanese who were citizens, who were detained and put in internment camps. So what is there to stop from this going back? Because people say, you don't have anything to be afraid about. Well, I don't know. And that's why I never identify anyone here who, whether or not they were, what status they had. But it's a known fact, so it's nothing that I have to keep secret because it's all in the books and things of that time. So there was that kind of fear and secrecy which perpetuate the kind of stereotypes that occurred about who are the Chinese. Why are they so secretive? Well, they had reason, because there were immigration raids in Chinatown during that time. That unannounced immigration officers would just go into the restaurant and raid to ask everybody for their IDs. And if you didn't have it, you were taken away. So that was, a fear. And the other thing that happened is there was no recourse in terms of the legal system for lots of things. And the example of that is what happened in New York City's Chinatown is the police would ask for bribes. They walked by at once a week to get the businesses in Chinatown have to pay the police off. The police, not the gangs, the police. Pay them off, and that's like protection money. And that if you didn't, you had to worry, about that. So that it was, and I'm going to fast forward, it wasn't until 1965 with the Johnson's Reunification Act where the new wave of immigration occurred with the Cantonese from Hong Kong. Prior to that, 90% of the Chinese in America were Toisanese. And what I mean by that is they came from the tiny little villages in Toisan, which is a very small part of all of China, and they were all peasant farmers. So they came as, quote, country bumpkins who knew nothing about urban life and about life in the city and so on, but this is where they came. After 1965, and because of communism, those who had family in the US moved out from China and ended up in Hong Kong and were waiting to be reunited. And in 1965, when that act was signed, was the opportunity to reunify families that had been separated, because prior to that, you had many men who were married with wives in China, but they lived alone because they couldn't bring their wives over. There was no opportunity. And they were, but they kept communication and so on. So after 1965, they brought, but it really brought two different cultures together, because now you had the youth who were grown up in the city with family and parents who were more city, they were no longer the peasant farmers. And for the first time in our country, we had Chinese gangs. And they did vicious things. I won't go into that. If we have time, I'll talk about that more. But prior to that, the function of the social society within the Chinatowns were largely made up of clan associations. In doing that, they were replicating what it was like in Toisan, because you live by villages, by your family name. So if you're a Lao, you live in the Lao village. If the son got married, the wife comes to the Lao village, so it's very insular in that. So when they got here, they created the Lao Association, the Chin Association, and all these associations. And what these clan associations did, they served many purposes. Today they are, they hardly exist, or they exist but in very different form. They did the social services, they were job employment, they were housing, letter writing, and so on. And they would rent a room, an apartment in Chinatown, the smaller associations. The largest, if you've been to Chinatown, there's the Merchants Association, the Chinese Benevolent Association. They're big and they've got some landmarks. The other associations are small ones, which is like a little 3-room apartment and all. And what they did is they rented out, all the members pay dues weekly or monthly, and there was always a room in the back. There was the main room, which is like, these are what we call railroad apartments. I don't know how many of you know what that is. It's really, a row of rooms, like a railroad car. And then the front room is the living room, and then you have it go back. So the front room, which was the living room, was where everybody gathered on Sundays. And then the back room, there's a kitchen in the back, but there was always the middle room, was then the bedroom. And people who came over, could spend very little money and room there until they found a place to live. And that was the purpose that it served. It served as a loan agency. People, I never understand the system because it's quite complicated, but it works. You contribute money to monthly to what they call in Chinese a void, and then when you need something to open up a laundry, so you want to take out a loan, and you bid for that loan, and whoever bids, you can get very, very low interest rates. So they never went to the banks, and they got that, and then so that was how it worked, and it worked well because lots of people were helped by that, and they didn't have to go to the banks. They were afraid to go to the banks, and so on. So the clan association served a really important social, economic, purpose, in that. And today, those no longer exist because people have the language skills and they've moved out and so on. But that was what it was like. The other things that were prominent in terms of time during that period is the social network. Many people who have gone to Chinatown sees only the glitz on the outside. They didn't see, the social network that was behind all of that. I realized the time, we're already at 4:38. So let me move a little more quickly into some of the stories here, which I think gives a nice flavor about that. Is that, so they didn't see the glitz behind, what, and that's what these stories talk about. It's not the glitz, it's not the tourism, it's not those kinds of things, but the things that made the community, made the Chinatowns feel safe, felt like a bonding experience, and did all the kinds of things that was important to that. And to this day, it still does that. But there are no longer Toisanese in your Chinatowns, because after the Cantonese came, and I'll go through this in 2 minutes, is then it was replaced by, not replaced, because the Taiwanese came, but they came for education. They came for education. So that's why we think, oftentimes, Szechuan food or Taiwanese food is sort of the more gourmet, and it's not. Cantonese food is actually the gourmet food in China, because people associate the Cantonese food as being cheap Chinese food. But in fact, it's the reverse in China, because people opened up restaurants in Chinatown or out in the outskirts, and there are two kinds of restaurants at that time, no longer. There were the Chinese restaurants that were for the non-Chinese, and we call them the lo fan. And then there were the Chinese restaurants that the Chinese would eat. And I've had people that would not recommend those restaurants to the non-Chinese because they felt they're going to change the menu and change the food. And it was different food. What was known as Chinese food at the time is egg rolls, spare ribs, chow mein with the fried noodles, and chop suey. Now, do you know what chop suey is translated into from the Chinese? It means a mix of different things. So it's sort of like slop. And no Chinese, or truly Chinese, ever eat that stuff, or ever ate it, because it didn't have, all it was celery and bean sprouts. Today, that's much less of a, when people say I want Chinese food, I don't think people do the chop suey as much anymore. They eat the real Chinese food, that the ones that we eat. But that was so the Taiwanese came, then China opened up, and we have Fujianese, we have Szechuanese, and now we have Chinese from all over. And the Chinatown now is, as I said, no longer the Toisanese, because they've all grown up, become professionals, so on and so forth, and they've moved out. The Cantonese, similarly. So now it's the Fujianese and the Szechuan, people who are there that makes up the Chinatown. So when I go into Chinatown now, I can't understand, I speak fluent Cantonese and Toisanese. I cannot understand what they're saying, because it's a different dialect, a totally different dialect. And so Chinatown has changed, and there's such a mix and quite different. So let me spend a couple of minutes on these books. So these were the stories that this book, Who Are the Cantonese Chinese, was more of a historical context about some of the things that I mentioned. And this is what brought it together, that I began to find there were common themes and stories that people had. And people were beginning to say the same things. Those who lived in Chinatown lived in railroad apartments, no toilet in the apartment. You had to go into the hall to get that. People who lived outside of Chinatown because they had laundries would come into Chinatown once a week and socialize, network, and all of that stuff. But they were the lone Asian in their neighborhoods, and they virtually all faced some form of discrimination, overt and covert. And so like a story of Debbie, who was a Miss Chinatown, that came in both books, is that she was the oldest of like 4 to 6 children, but she was not the first son, she was the first daughter, and that makes a huge difference. And she says, as they got more and more children, family dinner was still that one chicken, so that, she got less and less, to the point where she had to eat the bones. And to this day, she says, I love eating bones because that's all I got, so. And also, they lived in the back of the laundry, which was very common amongst them because they didn't have the means to be able to get a separate apartment. And what they did was, when her mother gave birth to every single child, they didn't have a place to go. So the mother gave birth in the back room, not in the hospital, and the kids had to wait outside until she gave birth. And the mother would get up and go to work the next morning, and she planned it so she would deliver at night, so she would not miss a day of work in the laundry. So those are the kinds of stories that came up. And the other, and then I want to kind of conclude, so I'll give a few minutes for questions, is we have people talking about what was life like. The fathers worked seven days a week if they worked in a restaurant, or they had one day off. And that's when they would come home. Late hours, they start early, end late, and so on. So as one member described it, it was like we were living in fatherless homes, because even though there was a father, they hardly ever saw them. And then the whole question about emotions, that one says, why didn't my father ever tell me he loved me? Well, there are differences in the expression of emotions, and I don't want anyone to go away from this thinking that Chinese are not emotional, or that they don't have emotions. It's a matter of how it's expressed. And that what I was touched by one story that said, this father didn't openly say things like, I love you, because that wasn't the norm then. Today, we do say things like that, with our children and all. But he says, but it was the gleam in my father's eye when we did something good, and you knew he was proud. And that's how we, and so he remembers that with great fondness and all. And let me skip over and do the sort of takeaway, so that we can, I can open it up for some questions. So many in the Chinatown became lifelong friends, and there was the notion of leaving Chinatown because they, and one of the things that I had asked in this was, what about success? Because you see many stories of Chinese success. I hope to capture that. Well, true to form, they're modest. They wouldn't talk about their own successes, even though I knew that they had success. They would talk about somebody else's success. So eventually what pulled together in discussion of these stories, that I end up with a different definition of success. The success was the notion that I made it out of the laundry. I don't have to work in the restaurant. That was the success. And as I heard our previous speaker, or one of the speakers here, is, as one member says here, and we did it in one generation. That was the pride, that they had. And the other was the issue of firsts. There are many firsts in this book, but they're firsts not of Nobel Prize winners, but they're firsts of, the first principle, in New York City, Chinatown. The first to do show business, like one played in The King and I at the age of 5. Nobody did that. They weren't given the opportunity, and there are many issues that we have today. And one became an investment banker, and growing up, he was not a big guy, but he would say, people would call him a chink, which is the derogatory term. And he said, and he reached a point where he says, "Who are you calling a chink?" And they would get into a fight, and he said he always got beat up because he was not that big of a guy, but they stopped calling him chink, and so on. So these were the challenges, and stories that occurred in that growing up, and that I ended up, as the first psychologist. I was the first psychologist to be, Asian psychologist, to be licensed in the state of Massachusetts. There were no other psychologists during my time, and when I became a psychologist, there were 15 of us in the country who were psychologists. And today, I'm running for APA president, with the notion of let's lead together. So I'm going where my elders never thought any of us would be able to go. So that, so things have changed, but yet the problems are still the same. When I look at the kinds of things we're facing in society today about immigration, I see many parallels and similarities and all. Thank you for your attention.